So hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you guys today about how tooling will, in my opinion, make or break serverless infrastructure. So just as a quick primer on who I am. So I'm Flo. I'm an independent AWS serverless and general development process consultant. I'm one of the co-founders and the former CTO of CodeShip, which is a CI/CD service, which is still going strong. So if you need CI/CD, check them out. And I was the CTO of Serverless Inc. for a while last year. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or send me an email if you have any questions or anything like that. So with that, I want to start by, obviously, as like I think every second talk here does, by defining what I think what serverless is actually, because we're still discussing that. There's many different opinions, and all of them have value, starting by an event-driven system. That's definitely part of it, and I think an event-driven system is definitely something that is part of that ecosystem, that is important for that. But in the end, it's an implementation detail. I don't really care if it's events, magic, fairy dust, or whatever triggering my small pieces of code. I don't really care. It's an implementation detail. It's not really that important for me. It's important once you implement something to think about that and know that, but it's not the core. Then there's the Cloud 2.0 super advanced cloud opinion that this is this, or like for all I care, the mighty scaling power cloud or whatever. Which is also true, because it's an evolution. It's like we're going further and further. We're taking more responsibility away from people, and you have more services that you can use by yourself. So totally valid, totally true point. But at least for me, it doesn't really capture what I feel, what the big transformational changes that we're currently going through, and that is really important. For me, that really, really, really evolves, as so many things do, around the team, around people. The important part for me with serverless, and what serverless means for me personally, is that we go to a world where we try to get the least amount of control and the least amount of responsibility for all the pieces in our infrastructure. Only where we really need the control and responsibility to fulfill our products, that's where we try to get this control and responsibility. Everywhere else, we just try to step away from it and let somebody else deal with that. It's an evolution. It's the same as with cloud. We're just way more steps beyond what we were able to do in the past, with compute being one of those services that we don't really have to care about in that same sense anymore. Complete automation is key to all of this. Unless you have complete automation, there's so many things that you can't do in the future, especially gradual escalation of control and responsibility. Like, you might want to start with Lambda, but maybe Lambda isn't the solution for you. Maybe you need AWS Batch, you need EC2, you need ECS. But you don't go from like Lambda to EC2. You go Lambda, maybe Elastic Beanstalk, maybe ECS. There can be steps in between where you gradually increase the control and responsibility that you have over your infrastructure. And that's important, because it isn't a binary choice anymore between like no control and a lot of control. There's a lot of steps in between. And I think you should very, very clearly think about those. And the last, and I think very equally important part for me, is building for replacement. And I think, as yesterday, for example, in the talk by Mike, was at the beginning of building something, you often don't really know what the optimal solution will be. So you have to replace your stuff. You have to replace your infrastructure. Or, and we all know that feeling, AWS comes out with a really new service, releases a GA that really solves a problem that we have and that we have to manage in a really nice way. So we want to include that. If you haven't built all of your services and all your processes around replacing stuff all the time, it's really hard to include that in your infrastructure. And so that's, for me, what I think about like the real transformational value in serverless. So what does this mean for our tools, actually? Like, how do our tools have to change, or what is the impact on our tools? I think, very importantly, the heavy lifting for most of the stuff that we do today, heavy lifting in the technical sense, is done by services. They're doing all the scaling, they're doing the provisioning, queuing systems, running all that stuff that you don't really want to do, and that AWS or other cloud providers do for you. And in the course of this talk, I'll keep it focused on AWS, but the same applies to other cloud providers as well. But the heavy lifting isn't done by you in the technical sense, that heavy lifting. So in the past, what we really cared about was features like replication, scalability to be possible for you, to be available. Because when you have tons of resources, but generic resources, and you want to use them effectively in a larger team, you need a tool, something that does the heavy lifting for you, to build those clusters out of those resources and create that for you. So you can not go crazy with having to manage each and every resource by itself. But that's a heavy lifting that is totally taken off your shoulders now, today. So when we go in the present, way more important is usability, accessibility, and not necessarily forcing you, but guiding you towards the best practice of using your system, because that means automation, that means being able to replace stuff in the future, and really making it easy to combine different services. That's the key part. It's not about the heavy lifting that you have to set everything up and manage in a complex way. You have to understand it, and you have to make your other people in your team understand what's happening there, include new things, include anything new that comes out, if applicable, because you want to move fast, you want to focus. And I think that's one of the main reasons that our tools are changing and need to change right now from the old view that we had. And I've seen this many times in my consulting work, in past work, bad tools push us away from services. If you have services that are really great services, but have really shitty UX, you just don't use it. Like there's queuing service. Lots of people just go, well, let me just set up my Redis and like do Rescue or Sidekick or whatever for my queuing system, because it might be a little bit of a pain in the ass to set up some other queuing system and to make that work, or like streaming so many other things where there is a really good service alternative, but it's just unreasonable to set it up because the UX is so bad. And the needs are relatively small, at least in the beginning. So you say, I don't care. Like, let's just do it myself. It's just easier. I know how to do it. I have the tools there. But that shouldn't be the case. When the tools get better and when that's reasonable to do, then we can go there. And I think the same problem applies to any company, no matter the size. The only difference is some companies just simply hire somebody, like Kapil from Capital One, for example, who then writes a tool to do AWS config and all the audit management. Most companies can't do that. Most companies simply won't do that, so they don't do specific things that are really important. Auditing, good IAM rules, starting with specific services, automation through CloudFormation. A lot of teams don't do that. Or go away and go to other tools like Terraform instead of CloudFormation that provide a really good start, but lead to really big problems in the long run, because you have to manage a lot of stuff yourself. You cannot take advantage of the whole ecosystem that is there in place. So a lot of that is just unreasonably complex to start. And we have to bring that back from unreasonable to reasonable. It doesn't have to be awesome. It just has to be reasonable, so we actually start doing it. I don't care if configuration is a little bit terse and a little bit too much, that it could be more perfect. Doesn't matter. As long as it gets the job done and gets it fast enough done, that's fine. So in my opinion, what's holding us back? What's the big thing that's really holding us back from reaching to that point, making that better? I think there are many services in our AWS that everybody uses or should use, but there's, in my opinion, one that will kind of makes or breaks, or is the key service that if you unlock that and can use that effectively, so much more stuff is possible. And for me, that's CloudFormation. CloudFormation is a great service that has a really horrible UX. And I don't necessarily mean the console. The console is fine. In general, I like the console. Like, it's usable. Like, most stuff is really well exposed there. But just the experience of writing CloudFormation templates, of deploying things to CloudFormation, is just not very good. It's hard to learn, hard to read the configuration. These huge files, because there's no built-in modularity. Of course, there's like sharing stacks and all that kind of stuff, but that's not really like the modularity that I'm talking about. Just not having a YAML file that has like 5,000 entries. Like, nobody understands that. It's impossible to understand it, to understand the relationships. So that means unreasonable. Unreasonable means you don't use it, means you either get another third-party tool in, or you completely go to something like Terraform away. And that's just not very good. And I think the most basic example for me that shows the missing UX are things like you cannot deploy something to CloudFormation and then just see the event output from the AWS CLI. Like, something very simple that you have to go to the AWS console with, which means I'm in my CLI, I want to deploy something to my dev staging environment or potentially production, although don't do that from your CLI, use the service. But then when something goes wrong, I might get an error page, but don't even see like the status and what's happening. And that just makes me uncomfortable, so I have to go to the CLI, I have to switch context, breaks me out of like the working loop that I'm currently in. And it's just a relatively small fix that could be done well, but AWS just isn't on the path to doing that. Maybe they are at some point, but they haven't been for a long time. And we need to see and acknowledge that and then do something about it. And a lot of people are. And for me, CloudFormation is our assembly code. CloudFormation is what you deploy into and what you use for any further setup of your infrastructure. Again, same applies to the resource managers of other providers. but it has to be automated, and it has to be the provider-native one. If it's not the provider-native one, in my opinion, you're going to run into long-term problems because you cannot use all the services. When something new comes out, it's really hard to integrate. You have to wait until Terraform or whatever else tool you use supports that specific new service. And that's just a long time to wait for when you want to include something immediately. So in my opinion, all tools should work towards CloudFormation, but doesn't necessarily have to do everything directly to CloudFormation. So standard endpoints like CloudFormation really allow us to swap out our tools. Like there is a fixed endpoint that we're talking about, a fixed configuration that it all ends up with. We might build a nicer syntax on top of that, but in the end, it's something that I can just throw away this tool when it doesn't fulfill what I need anymore, or when I have to go from like 1 person to 30 people in the team or whatever, scale it up, and just a tool doesn't work perfectly anymore. I can just put in a different tool, put in a different team, and make that work. If there isn't any further abstractions, which I'll go into in just a second. But yeah, it's just not possible with other tools like Terraform. And Terraform is a great tool, HashiCorp is a great company, but I think the underlying problem why this tool even exists shouldn't be there, because the UX has to be better. And with shared state somewhere else than in AWS, that's a big problem. It's much easier to support standards. I'm not a big fan of like forcing standards through tooling. I think you cannot really force a standard through tooling, because either you're limiting people in what they can do way too much, or people will work around it, so in the end you end up with a system that doesn't follow your standards, because you're trying to limit it at a place where it shouldn't be. It should all go through auditing. But once you have the auditing set up and your team knows, okay, I need to change, I need to follow that standard, you can set that up much easier, because you're able, because of that format, because of CloudFormation being the end service in the end where everything goes in, you can share different teams that use different tools to achieve that goal, but they can still do the same thing. You still have that endpoint, that assembly code that is the same for everyone, but they can use different tools, different approaches to eventually get there. And something that I personally really like, because with my history of like doing CI, CD, and tooling in general, I just like building like my own like deployment scripts, because like Make or Bash or any other of these tools is really great in combining tools together. So it makes it possible to build better low-level tools that work well together with each other. And as an example, a while ago, like I deploy everything to CloudFormation, and oftentimes you deploy something and then you need to do something with the resource that you just created. One of the best practices of CloudFormation is don't give it specific names. If you give a specific names to an S3 bucket, you're going to run into problems, because when you deploy that into staging or dev, you'll have a problem because the same bucket needs to be used. So you want to use dynamic names wherever possible. But then you have to do some mapping, or you have to copy it out of there, which is the worst, like going into the console or running on CLI, copying out of there, putting that into a script or the CLI again and as a parameter. That's no fun. I built a small script just for myself, a small tool just for myself that just goes into CloudFormation for a stack, puts in the logical ID, gets out the physical ID, and I can use that in any other kind of command, be it either AWS commands or Echo commands. And that stuff really is only possible if you have a central system that everybody works against, like CloudFormation, where all the configuration is stored, and where you can pull it out, write small teams for your different needs, small tools for your different needs, and make it work. So with all of that, to get there, to get these small teams, small tools, and to make that work, what do we really need to watch out for, and what are the problems that we're currently, in my opinion, running into, and that we're currently, like the corners that we're building ourselves into? I think the most important one is we need to stop building abstractions on top of cloud providers. It's the same cycle every time. I just need this small thing, but really only this small thing. But really, when I look at this, it could really also do this thing. And I mean, when it does these 2, 3 things, like, let's make this simpler and like introduce a layer on top of that. That makes it even simpler and a small abstraction. So like everybody else can use the same thing, and it's easier to share inside of our team and all that kind of stuff. And you end up with, oh my God, this is so complex, and I'm not able to use this new thing anymore. So I kind of have to like start over and take the CloudFormation template or whatever and just do it again. And that wheel just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And we just need to stop this. This is just not very productive, because it's painful for everyone at some point, and you might buy a little bit of an early lead, but it'll be painful in the long run. And it's really about, there is no one tool to rule them all, in my opinion. In the past, that was a lot truer, because if you just have a lot of resources and you need to build them together into larger systems, and the same applies today to the container ecosystem. That's what Kubernetes is basically, the one tool to rule them all, the one tool that everything else depends on. And that's totally fine in that ecosystem because it makes sense. If everything is a resource and you just push them together and you have one thing that makes sure that everything works well together, you need that. That is not applicable, in my opinion, to a serverless and like cloud ecosystem like we have in AWS or that we're all trying to achieve. Because it's not about that one tool. It's not about like making something really complex simpler. It's about taking a lot of different small, less complex things and making sure that they work well with each other. And that's a different problem that we're trying to solve. And we're using the same kind of ideas that we've used in the past to the new system. And I think that's just not working out really well in many different instances. I had a conversation with Kevin McGrath about this presentation. He gave me some great feedback a few days ago. And one thing that I really, really liked, a sentence that he said, was we're starting to put monolithic tools in front of microservice or cloud or serverless architectures. So we're moving the thing that where everything is in one back from our infrastructure into our tooling just to make all of that work. And I think that's not really the best idea, probably. And there will be, because different teams have different needs. Different teams use different services. The tooling that you use to set up like a data ingestion cluster or a compute service or a background worker service might be different tools because it needs to do different things. And like the same kinds of tools or the same group of tools will probably not be applicable everywhere, but you want to do the same kind of standards, similar processes, and ways to audit all of that. So what he also mentioned is, and while I don't know if it needs a specific term, and I'm pretty sure that he agrees that it doesn't need a specific term, this sense of microtooling, like small tools, and I mean, I'll come back to that later on, but basically the UNIX philosophy. Small tools that do want, obviously every tool talk needs to have the UNIX philosophy in it, that's just part of it. But really small tools that do really small things and work really well together with each other and nothing else. And if we look at like why do we do serverless infrastructure, it's really about like we don't want to have to deal with things. We don't want to have the control. I don't want the power and the control of things anymore. I want somebody else to be responsible and to do it. Obviously, in the end, like we're responsible for our customers' success with our products, but that also means we put that trust and extend it into AWS's hands because they do a really good job and a much better job than in most cases we could do because the resources and the scale is just way different from what we do. So in the past, when we had like hardware, total power and control, cloud instance, a lot less when you do something on ECS. PaaS, so Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku, all that kind of stuff. A lot less power and control, and compared to serverless, that is even less. But now we've limited that to as much as we can, basically. So if you put more tools in place that limit that power and control even further, that's not necessarily helping. Because the goal is, again, combining the services. It's not hard part of setting it up, but making it long-term sustainable to have 50 or 60 or whatever, how many different services AWS has, have them work together in different combinations for different teams in different AWS accounts without going crazy and with always knowing that like it conforms to our standards, it passes our audits. And that's not just important for large companies, but we also in small companies want to know if we're doing the right thing at the right time. And additionally, AWS is just moving too fast. AWS is moving way too fast for tools that try to do everything to keep up. Like last year, so that was the slides from last year at reInvent, 1,000+ changes in 2016. It'll be way more in next year. So anything that tries to be that one tool to rule them all necessarily, that's just hard. That's just really hard. And then you don't just have to wait for like AWS to come out with something and then CloudFormation to support it, which sadly lags behind oftentimes a little bit. But then the tool needs to support it, and then you can introduce it into your systems. That lead time is kind of slow, and that's not really what we want. So we need something that doesn't try to hide these things, doesn't try to hide these complexities, but give you the tools to move fast enough in that direction. And I'm personally, also when it comes to multi-provider tooling, I think that's the same kind of approach that we see more and more like where it's, for example, Terraform. And I totally get why they're doing it, and especially why it's like on your own personal infrastructure and what they're trying to approach with it. But I think there's a lot of problems with using tools that are inherently multi-provider because it always gets dragged down to the lowest common denominator. It's even if you fight it really, really hard, it's, in my opinion, basically inevitably happening, that you have something that is the lowest common denominator. And that is great for like small projects or small things, but over time, when you want to introduce more things, it just it stands in your way. It doesn't give you enough power, in my opinion. You sacrifice longer-term power and success and speed to very little early-term things. And I think that's just, in a lot of cases, not the right way to go. And in a serverless infrastructure, I'm still waiting to see an example of somebody who is on AWS, lifts everything up out of all the services, moves it over to Google, places it in there. Unless you're doing just EC2 and basically doing cloud in the same way that you did hardware in the past, I haven't seen an example yet of somebody doing that. I'd love to talk to you guys if you have ever done that. But I think optimizing our tooling and optimizing our internal processes to be able to do that in the future is, it's fine, but it's just going to be a lot of work for something that will probably never really pay off. Because what you're probably going to do, and what we all probably see a lot, is a little bit in AWS, a little bit in Google, a little bit in Azure, and it's just all over the place. And I think that's the infrastructure of the future. And for that situations, it's OK to have different tools for different providers. Because the surface area from each of those providers gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The things that you need to necessarily know and understand get smaller. Because in many cases, the default settings for a service, the default settings for SQS, and the default settings for a DynamoDB might be totally fine for a long, 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 long time for you. And only over time, when you really know that you need to go deeper there, then it'll show up. But a lot of the stuff that you can put into services work really well from the beginning, and you can optimize later on. But not having the tooling and with that specific provider is really hard in that case. So in my opinion, what can we do about all of that? So first of all, obviously, let's fix CloudFormation. No, let's not do that. Let's not try to fix CloudFormation or other services. They don't need to be fixed. It's not what the problem is that we need to do something that hides it and fixes it at all. It needs just some love and some better UX. First of all, I really want to hug the CloudFormation guys, because what they're doing is really, really hard. And I know we're getting pissed off by many different things constantly. And when stuff gets released, and it's so cool, but it's not in CloudFormation. And I know it sucks. I've been in the situation many, many different times. But what they're doing is really, really hard. And it works, I think, reasonably well. When you use it, it works actually very, very well, especially when you try to do that kind of on your own. It's just very, very painful. So a really good service with a questionable set of UX at this point. And I'm not talking about the UI on the console, but just the CLI is just not very good. And I think that shows why a lot of tools are coming out all the time for that. And I think running into that problem of trying to fix something that isn't inherently broken is, so I recently built another small tool, basically because I knew for my consulting and for writing a lot of content, I needed something that is very low level and to talk to CloudFormation. So something that is super simple. So looked around, existing tools, Serverless, Stacker, AWS-less, serverless, Gordon, condensation, all great tools in and of themselves, but they try to introduce more stuff than they necessarily need to. So stack environments, specific dependence, how to do dependencies, stack naming, languages, how to create a specific configuration file, all understandable features, especially out of the companies that they were born out of, but not necessarily what I wanted. So obviously, I ignored all of that advice, built it on top of Troposphere in a Python library, so I have my own abstractions, and immediately the next time around when AWS released something cool that I wanted to use and Troposphere didn't support it, I was why did I do that? And I had a great conversation with Kapil from Capital One, and one of the things that he told me that I've really taken to heart, maybe even more than he thought at first, is Makefile is my deployment framework. Meaning that small tools that work well together and that you can combine in various different ways that talk against one certain endpoint, and you just set them up for this project in this way, for this project in that way, but using the tools that are already available to us, like Make, that is everywhere, and not necessarily trying to do everything in once. And obviously, the UNIX philosophy, and treating CloudFormation as our pipes. We put something in CloudFormation, and then it comes out on the other hand. But not just CloudFormation as our pipes. Really, pipes are our pipes. There is no reason why we couldn't create a CloudFormation template out of smaller tools that just output something in JSON, because it's just unreasonably complex to write it yourself sometimes. But it's not just tooling, it's also documentation. So documentation is fine at the moment, but it's really not that easy to get started with everything there. So, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve on the existing syntax. That means we shouldn't add more abstractions, but doesn't mean that we can improve the syntax. So serverless, Gordon, Zappa are great for setting up, for example, API gateway and lambdas. Great tools in that regard. And We could totally have other tools for specific things, like a very simple preprocessor that just takes either a Swagger file or your own kind of small syntax and translates it into CloudFormation templates for API gateway, so that you can still know what's happening there. You just compile it down to like that JSON or YAML, and at some point, if that tool doesn't suffice what you want to do, and you just want to go like all in on the CloudFormation and have more control, it's here for you. And it's not, doesn't have any abstractions, doesn't have any complexities in it. It's the same thing, and it just gets deployed separately. So really, a suite of small focused tools that I've like built the first two, for example, and there's some ideas that I want to put out there because I want to either see it or I need to build some of them myself because I need them for my consulting. But I think it's not about those necessarily all of those large tools, and that's the one thing that opens up our infrastructure for us. But it's about combining all these different things together, but all of them having a standard way to go through. So none of those tools, for example, in my opinion, should talk to CloudFormation. It's all of them put out some CloudFormation template, and then another tool like just gobbles them up, creates something out of it, and pushes it out there. It's okay to have 3 or 4 different lines in a deployment script. It's fine. It's not bad. It's okay. And I think that's really, that's something that we're not always as comfortable with, and I think we should be. And I think the nicest thing to come out of that is that they're small, they're simple, so go build some yourself. There is no reason why you couldn't write a small script, a small tool yourself that just works really well for your internal system, that doesn't have any abstractions, that just adds a little bit of a nicer UX to something, shows you some information that you didn't have before. There is no reason to wait for tool vendors to do that. Write your own tools, release them, share them as open source, share them with the community. I think that's really important, that we start thinking about these small tools and not just about these larger tool providers, and just getting there together as a community. And definitely, I mean, learning CloudFormation in depth is something that you probably won't be able to get around. I'll definitely write more about that in the future because I think it's such a core service. And the AWS documentation, like everything on AWS, everything is documented, but that doesn't mean you can find it really. Like, it's a lot of work to really get through it, and there's not a lot of like core things that you really need to understand necessarily. So yeah, if you have any questions, happy to answer them now, anytime else. Ping me if you want anything else. And yeah, just to go over my conclusions, composition and accessibility, not features and abstractions, are what will make our next set of tooling, in my opinion, great. Build new small tools that do one thing well, really only one thing. They only have to do one thing and then combine them to do something larger. And compose larger system out of several smaller tools. Check out Make. I only started using Make like over the last like 2 or 3 months. And for like instead of replacing my bash scripts, that works totally fine. Like, it does exactly what my bash scripts did in the past. Just I have to do less checking of things because it just does it for me. But tabbing is still, for everybody who uses Make or knows Make, I hate the tabbing as much as everybody else. And my last conclusion is please join the serverless Slack forum. It's really good. It's really good. There's a lot of conversation there all the time. A lot of the people, a lot of the speakers that are in here are there all the time. I really like that place, and I want to have more people of the community in there. So thank you. So I think we have a few minutes left. I think that started a little late, but we have a few minutes left. So if there's any questions, happy to answer them. Sorry, what? Yeah. The slides and everything else there will be on my page at flowmotlik.me. So transformations and like Sam started, but the problem is like what I wanted to do and why I built like the old client. What I wanted to have is like I want to have like 5 different YAML files or JSON files, and I just wanted to like be combined into one, so I can put like the DNS stuff over here, like everything that should be in one stack, but separate from each other. Like here's this one file that has these things. Here's this other file. Here is like, for example, like DNS, like an A record looks like an A record in AWS in Route 53 all the time. It's the same thing all the time. So I don't need to repeat myself all the time. So I want some like simple modularity to be able to say, include that thing with transforms. Yes. So the problem with that is, so the problem with that is that it has to be, for example, deployed in an S3 bucket or something. I don't think that it's possible with those transforms to do it like locally and just in your development environment and just share the stuff. I think that's more, it's a great tooling for like when you want to share snippets across the company. It's not so great, I think at least, for like sharing one stack or like splitting one stack in one repository. That's not really what is there. Yeah?
I know we talked about this the other night, but I'm going to ask anyway. So if we're building a lot of small tools anyway, why build them on top of CloudFormation and not just on top of the CLI?
Because what CloudFormation provides you is just going back and forth history and like a more secure deployment. The problem that I see with CLI is that it's really hard to manage the state and the dependencies between different resources. So you want to have a ref of something. You want to make it possible to deploy it only when everything works. Then everything should really go live. So the whole depends on stuff that you can do in CloudFormation. And I think that's where CloudFormation is really strong, like really making sure that you have kind of atomic deploys. There's some spaces where it's not atomic, but generally, when you deploy something new, it's generally atomic. When you remove stuff, that might not happen. But I think that's where I see the value of CloudFormation. It's really like that going from one state to the next one without getting stuck somewhere in between. CloudFormation does a relatively good job there, and giving you the overview, giving you like some place to talk to and make a secure update everywhere. And without having to give people direct access into like every single resource to be able to set up their own stuff without following those standards. That's kind of why I personally really like and enjoy CloudFormation. Sorry, yeah? No, you.
Yeah. So you talked about the CloudFormation CLI that's there, and you had issues with it, and you were saying there aren't enough errors that come up. It doesn't give you the status of the stack. So I know the CLI has. Have you seen the wait command?
I have seen the wait command.
So is that not quite realistic? Like, what would you want out of the two?
So the problem with the wait command is that it stops, it doesn't say anything, it doesn't do anything, and at the end it just fails or not, like the exit status. So that's because it's built on the waiters in Bodo 3, which are just on the library side. And what I want is I want to see, and that's why I built the tool that I use, because it just shows me like all the different events that you can see in the AWS CLI. While a deployment is happening, I just want to know what's happening, what's going on. My goal is basically I don't want to leave my CLI. I don't want to have to go into the console to just get very basic information about like the stuff that is happening, especially in CloudFormation, because that's like the key thing to deploy everything else. Obviously, I think there's other tooling that needs to be good for like auditing, for accessing logs, accessing metrics. Like having to go into the CLI for those is also not very pleasant. But yeah, especially for that one. I think my time is up, but I'm happy to answer the question. So I think that question will go a little bit longer. Can we take that later on? Because I think my time is up and the next speaker needs to come up. But I'll catch you outside and then we can chat about that more. Cool. Thanks, everyone.